Content note. This video focuses on how nerdy online spaces became rife with fascists, and therefore discusses their beliefs. Content warning for transphobia, ableism, racism, anti-Semitism, and sexism. Please proceed with caution. Before I begin, I want to state that this video and its script was inspired by Innuendo Studios' video How to Radicalize a Normie, the Pewdie Pipeline by Non-Compete, and The Rise and Fall of Geek Culture by Sarah Zed. These are by far my favorite videos on YouTube, especially How to Radicalize a Normie, so if you haven't seen them yet, please go and check them out. In this video, I want to bring up points that these creators made in their videos, but obviously add my own insight as someone who has spent my own time in nerdy fandom spaces. My thesis is that due to the rise in mainstream popularity of once nerdy subcultures during the early 2000s, cis-het white male nerds who tied their entire oppressed identity to their geeky niche interests were especially vulnerable to alt-right political ideology, as the properties they knew and loved came under widespread scrutiny, and how once everyone was a self-proclaimed nerd, no one was. So without further ado, let's go. So, what is a nerd? Well, if you Google the definition, it reads, a person who is extremely enthusiastic and knowledgeable about a particular subject, especially one of specialist or niche interest. The word geek, which is sometimes used interchangeably with the word nerd, has a similar definition. A geek is a person who is knowledgeable about and obsessively interested in a particular subject, especially one that is technical or of specialist or niche interest. The difference is that geeks typically are knowledgeable about tech, like computer geeks for example. Remember the Geek Squad? While nerds are into intellectual pursuits, like reading high fantasy books. There are also dorks and losers, and some people take these labels really seriously. In fact, if you're one of those people, you might be a nerd. Haha. I actually found dozens of articles from the late 2000s and early 2010s trying to discern the minute differences between geeks, losers, nerds, hipsters, and dorks, but in the end, it doesn't really matter. All of these words are describing the same type of person, that for the purposes of this video, I'm going to call a geek or a nerd. A person who is really enthusiastic about something or various things that aren't necessarily seen as acceptable interests by the mainstream. Think D&D, Magic the Gathering, role-playing games, cosplay, complex puzzles, comic books, manga, anime, video gaming, high fantasy and sci-fi works, etc. It's common for nerds or geeks to fixate on certain intellectual properties or on different facets of the world around them, like knowing a lot about flags for instance, or about an obscure book, or how computers work, etc. And though some of these interests may be acceptable, the hobby tends to go too far from an outsider's perspective, and thus people like this are seen as odd, and are unfortunately mocked for their personal interests and their enthusiasm for said interest. Yes, in short, nerds are people who get mocked for being excited about things that make them happy. This happens at school to children and teens, but also to adult nerds, who may spend their money on action figures, card games, or cosplays that are meaningless to the average person, but are worth every cent to the owner. People who fall under the labels of nerd or geek may also be a bit socially awkward or neurodivergent, but not all the time. The widely successful show The Big Bang Theory is at times called nerd blackface, for how it creates caricatures of nerds for the audience to laugh at. Whether you agree with the term blackface being used here or not is up to you. I personally don't think it's comparable, and we should just call the show for what it is, ableist, sexist, and racist. But in all, the series begs us to look at how sad these adult men are for their childish interests, laugh at how they never got over their high school trauma, laugh at Sheldon's autistic coding. So because of social ridicule, either at the expense of the nerds' interests in niche cultural artifacts, or at their seeming social ineptitude, or both, it's no wonder that gatekeeping arouses around nerd culture, why nerds and geeks fight over labels of what to call themselves, and who gets to be a part of fandom. But in general, nerd communities and fandom spaces are happy places where people can make friends with others who have the same interests as them. It's especially good for people who have a hard time breaking the ice with others, like those who are neurodivergent, because the ice is already broken. Plus, being really fixated on something is seen as normal in these spaces, rather than weird. In addition, people already at the margins of society, people of color, people who are neurodivergent, and people who identify as LGBTQ+, gravitate towards nerdy interest because they want to get lost in another world, since the world they currently inhabit is actively hostile to them. And whether they get lost in coding, sewing cosplays, reading comics, or analyzing a great number of things, having an escape in your own community of people who share traits and interests feels good. And though fandom is very diverse with people from all walks of life, when people tend to think of nerds or geeks, most people think of cishet white dudes. Hence the reason The Big Bang Theory is hated so much. It whitewashed nerd and fandom culture. You might think of black nerds like Urkel or Carlton or Raj from the previously mentioned series, but in all, nerd representation in media tends to lean pretty white. And you might be wondering, why is that? After I just explained how diverse nerds are. Well, it's hard to give one definitive answer, but I'll try to do so here. Firstly, the properties that most fandoms form around are of cishet white dudes: Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, Game of Thrones, and Harry Potter. So it makes sense for people to think that people who like Luke Skywalker also look like him. You might find it ironic that people of marginalized identities tend to so strongly fan over work that doesn't have many people of color in them or diversity in general, but it makes sense if you think about how these sci-fi and fantasy works create a new world, where fans can insert themselves and create their own rules. In addition, sci-fi works like Star Trek champion diversity and inclusivity rather than shy away from it. Also, sci-fi and fantasy works lend themselves well to reinterpretations and reboots. Thus, there's opportunities to make media more inclusive and evolve it as time goes on, as many nerdy properties tend to be older and aren't always the most progressive. Secondly, the studios who create these beloved properties just tend to put white fans at the forefront because that's where the money's at. That's why Disney made sure not to make Finn a Jedi, why they took Kelly Marie Tran off Star Wars merch, and why just this year they started selling Rey's the yellow lightsaber when the series wrapped years ago. So much for progressive reboots, but I did say they had the opportunity, I never said they actually took it, unfortunately. But of course, it's not just white male fans, white female fans can be just as ruthless. Look at how they reacted to when Rue became black in the Hunger Games adaptations, when in fact she was always black. Not to mention the whitewashing of Katniss, who was olive skinned in the books, but portrayed by a white actress. A vehicle like the Hunger Games would have been huge for an actress of color, but of course they gave it to a white woman. Thirdly, white male fans just push themselves to the front. Unsurprisingly enough, they're very entitled. They're the ones who do the gatekeeping, who have to know more than you do, who police other fans and other nerds. This was best illustrated during the My Little Pony Friendship is Magic days, when the white male fan base was saying who and who doesn't get to be a fan of MLP, a franchise that many women and girls propped up for decades. The show and its merch ended up catering itself to the male fans, even getting rid of the brushable hair on the toy ponies for a while, which was a staple of the brand. Instead, they opted to create plastic collectible minifigs that male fans were more inclined to buy. Lastly, and most obviously, white male nerd representation is so rampant in Hollywood media because writers' rooms are filled with white men. They're the ones getting the chances to make their stories known. Revenge of the Nerds, Freaks and Geeks, and characters like Dwight and even the nerds of The Big Bang Theory are white, or at least almost all white, because that's white male privilege at work. So we now know how and why cishet white men are who we think of when we think of nerds, but now I want to explore why these white men who dominate fandom spaces and whose money is able to sway multi-million-dollar franchises feel as if they're marginalized.
You're gonna go through life thinking that girls don't like you because you're a nerd. And I want you to know from the bottom of my heart that that won't be true. It'll be because you're an asshole.
Some nerdy white men feel oppressed as adults because they never properly coped with what happened to them in high school. They were bullied for their geeky interests, and that effed them up. And that's perfectly fair. A lot of us haven't gotten over our high school trauma, and the expectations of being a man are impossible to live up to. You have to be an athlete, a breadwinner, great in bed, have tons of sexual partners, have tons of money, and be emotionally stoic. No one can be all of those things at once, if at all. But rather than trying to work through toxic masculinity, these types of men blame women and other marginalized people for their problems and for why the world is doomed. And in high school and college, they vowed, once they grew up, to become the oppressor. The new male power fantasy of the late 20th century and later the new millennia wasn't to shed your nerdy outer shell and transform into an alpha male, but to embrace your geekiness and use it to get the house, the car, and most importantly, the girl of your dreams. And this change coincided, of course, with the rise of the computer and the digital age, when STEM fields as well as finance were the new tickets to success. It's the revenge of the nerds, if you will. The smart is the new sexy that was promised to the tech bros and geeks. In fact, that's when these terms nerd and geek really took off, after the invention of the teenager and after the baby boom. This is when you see the rise of Steve Jobs and Bill Gates and later Bezos, Musk, and Zuckerberg pioneering the digital age. What was promised with the coming of the internet was egalitarianism, but that was far from what transpired. It was of course upper middle class white male geeks who had the time, the access, and the privilege to spend their days working on computers who reaped the benefits of computing, not the working class who didn't have the ability to risk it all for something unforeseeable. But instead of seeing themselves as in the right place at the right time, lucky and privileged enough to have a head start, they continued to view themselves as underdogs. They, to this day, see themselves as disruptors, who sell their stories as the nerdy kids who finally got what they deserved. When in reality, these men always had what they were promised, they just thought they didn't because they were bullied for playing video games and they didn't get the cheerleader. And before we continue, I want to say that though toxic masculinity is oppressive, it also doesn't mean that men are faultless and not responsible for their actions, especially when they work to reproduce the system that hurt them. Additionally, I'm not saying that all white men look up to these figures or that all white men ended up wildly rich like Mark and Jeff did, far from it, but that there's a subset of the white male population who, like these examples, also feel angry that they didn't get what they were entitled to by virtue of being white men. This is detailed in Pop Culture Detective's Adorable Misogyny video where they talk about how some nerdy or geeky men are rejected by masculinity. They can't fit in and are dubbed nerds, geeks, or dorks. They're different from male nerds who purposely reject traditional masculinity in that these so-called nerds actually really try hard to fulfill their patriarchal role. They want to fit in and are upset that they can't. They're resentful towards women and minorities and don't align themselves with them, even though they know what it's like to be bullied for things out of your control. But because they can't achieve masculinity through the traditional routes, through women, money, or athleticism, they embrace nerddom and fandom because in those spaces they can be superior. They can be the ones who know it all. And then they're tolerated because they like the same stuff you do. And I just want to bring home here that not all white male nerds are like this, and that there are a lot of them who don't fall into this resentful category, white men who are confident in themselves and reject so-called traditional masculine values. But there are some white men who are vengeful, and they can't be ignored because these self-declared nerds and geeks were the same men who later became part of an ever-growing fascist movement. To conclude this section, there's a subset of cis-het white male nerds who wear the geek label and are actually oppressed by toxic masculinity, but turn their backs on liberal ideology as a way to free themselves and instead embrace the right because that's where they have the most to gain and where their entitlement is legitimized. In addition, this demographic of people are the ones who don't really have to do anything about injustice or oppression. They have no skin in the game and just want to juxtapose themselves against actual underprivileged people because it benefits them. It positions them as nice guys, as victims, with a seemingly noteworthy cause, when in reality they're choosing to wallow in hate and misery because if they actually see the truth, that they're privileged and that there's a way out, it will destroy them. And that's because they tie their nerdy interests heavily to their identity and see them as the reason as to why they're oppressed, rather than again, the capitalist patriarchy. So because these interests are so integral to who they are as people, when you critique something that they like, whether it be an anime, a manga, or a comic, they take it as a personal slight, a threat to their identity, and worse, to their moral characters and supposed subjugation. So naturally, these types of people who tie their identity and moral worth as well as societal mistreatment to their personal interests rejoiced when their niche interests were popularized in the mainstream at the dawn of the 21st century. I'm kidding, of course. They hated it. Though I think at first many were excited to have their favorite works brought to life and finally get the big screen adaptations that they deserve, I also think the white people in these spaces felt a little taken aback. They began to see that these nerdy properties like X-Men, Spider-Man, Batman, Lord of the Rings, and Game of Thrones didn't just appeal to a small select few who were in the know, but in fact had mass appeal. Which wasn't really a secret. Star Wars Mania proved that, and in fact the prequel trilogy came out around this time. However, the perceived problem was that everyday people seemed to like the same things as these so-called losers did. And when that happened, the nerds, the geeks, and the dorks had lost the thing that made them seem like they had a legitimate cause. Which again, these men do have a legitimate cause to fight against, but they also actively choose to place blame on anything else but the hand that feeds them. The biggest titles of the early 2000s were based on Marvel Comics, like the Spider-Man trilogy, and DC Comics with the Dark Knight series, and of course, like I mentioned before, the much-awaited Star Wars prequels. X-Men was also released along with 2 other movies. And of course, Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy became some of the most awarded movies in history. For better or for worse, The Big Bang Theory, which premiered in 2007, also helped mainstream nerd culture, even if some people saw it as appropriative, since they both mocked the nerdy things that the characters liked, and also the characters themselves were called not nerdy enough, because they just liked mainstream pop culture things. I personally don't like that last take as much because it gatekeeps what you have to like and know to be considered a nerd, when I think the label is based more on one's enthusiasm and dedication rather than the properties you're interested in. But anyway, the show itself is known for having big name stars that geeks in science and tech bros would be familiar with, like Adam West, James Earl Jones, Carrie Fisher, Sarah Michelle Gellar, Neil deGrasse Tyson, Stephen Hawking, Bill Gates, Elon Musk, and many more. Though I will say I don't think many actual nerds like Musk, Gates, or Tyson. Yes, actual non-toxic nerds exist. Despite this video focusing on bad faith actors or nerds who are bigoted, fandom is also filled with great people who are nothing like these people who are the focus of this video. But going back to the aforementioned TV show, even though some nerds at the time hated The Big Bang Theory, post-2016 election I think that it actually does a pretty accurate job at depicting how freaking terrible nerd culture can be, albeit by accident. It almost makes you wonder if the backlash by some nerds was done purposefully so we wouldn't take the time to dissect the real problems with geek culture presented in the show. However, the series is also extremely annoying in that it wants to have its cake and eat it too. They want us to sympathize with the same people who harass the women in their lives and who make racist remarks to their friends. In addition, Sheldon is heavily coded to be autistic, but rather than embracing that part of him, it's used as a comedic element. And not only that, but it's used to make him hyper sexist and hyper racist because he just can't help it. Being neurodivergent doesn't automatically make you a racist and sexist pig with no filter, and being on the autism spectrum doesn't give you a free pass to just say the worst things ever either. But the show relies on Sheldon's quirks, as they're called, as the show never diagnoses him, to get away with a lot of non-PC jokes, as well as to mock nerds and people with autism. This is mainly because Chuck Lorre has some vendetta against nerds, and rather than making a show about how awesome they are, they just do the opposite of that. But going back to my thesis, the mainstreaming of nerd culture upset fans who like to gatekeep and therefore saw this rise of geek culture as appropriative, and became angry that liking nerdy stuff was becoming in vogue. After years of being told that your interests are unimportant and cringy, I get how it can feel hypocritical that the person who bullied you for enjoying things now enjoys those same things. Though I should note that even though things like superheroes and fantasy books and even role-playing games became more normalized, there's still a line. I don't think people who are obsessed with anime or people who are furries are seen as cool, even though Converse did use fursuits to advertise their shoes in 2019. In all, the rise in popularity of stereotypically geeky properties made white cishet nerds and geeks look in the mirror and see that, wait a second, they had privilege all along. So with greater popularity of the things that they liked, white cishet nerds didn't just lose the part of their identity that was tied to their perceived oppression, they also faced the double whammy of having their beloved franchises and intellectual properties ruined by critics. And these critics were empowered with a new place to voice their concerns, the internet, which by the 2010s was now widely available and used by millions of people. Of course, criticism of these works already existed from fans and non-fans, but now the larger public had a say as well. The criticism came from both bad faith critics who solely wanted to ruin your childhood for money by pointing out flaws in media that were never actually flaws, and from what would later be known as SJW critics by the right, or people who wanted to point out more pernicious or problematic elements in nerd culture in order to identify them, so creators and studios stopped perpetuating the same tired, sexist, racist, trans, and homophobic tropes. The rise of nerd culture wonderfully collided with fourth-wave feminism, which led some people to cheer, while others called BS. If you're familiar with this story, you already know about Anita Sarkeesian, who sought to bring awareness about sexist tropes in video games and film. She, a video game herself, even conceded that, and say it with me, it's both possible and even necessary to simultaneously enjoy media while also being critical of its more problematic and pernicious aspects. But even with this conceit in every single video, she was dogpiled, doxxed, and sent death threats. She received nonstop hate from men who felt threatened by this brave new world where women were having a bigger and bigger say in fandom and pop culture. And even though they could never say it out loud, at the bottom of these angry video game nerds' hearts, they knew the concerns and criticisms were all valid. which is why it felt to them as though they personally were being attacked for liking things with problems. This examination of the properties that made them happy cut into them deeply. Mainly because they simply saw them as an escape and entertainment. Since they're the hegemonic default as cis-het white males, it's harder for them to see any real problems with the things that they enjoy. In addition, as we've discussed before, they tie these properties to their oppression, and when they realize that what they like actually isn't oppressing them, and in fact oppressing others, they shut down. And this leads us to the last and most important reason as to why they can't take criticism of their favorite works, and that's because they see them as part of who they are. If they like something that's problematic, that must mean that they too are problematic, even if that's not necessarily true. Just because you like something with problems doesn't make you a bad person, but to people like this, it's all one and the same, and therefore they must die on this hill that whatever they like is flawless, and that you're just complaining about nothing, or being too sensitive, or a number of other excuses to not reflect on what they've constructed their identity around. And honestly, I blame nerd and geek culture for this bad faith take that if you like something with problems, you're quote-unquote stupid or a bad person. Like if I said, I like Beauty and the Beast back then, someone might say, so you endorse bestiality? And this was an actually very clever tactic used by bad faith critics all the time to make you hate criticism of anything and to eventually stop criticism and critics altogether. It was a technique used by angry men who didn't like the fact that their favorite show was being attacked, as they also saw this as a personal attack. So they decided to subject everyone to this horrible way of thinking to make it impossible to critique anything because no one wants to be called a bad person. So therefore nothing is really bad or needs to be critiqued or fixed. Let's just go back to enjoying things. These angry nerds wanted to make criticism of the things that they enjoy look ridiculous, and through bad faith takes they did just that. They diminished the value there is to be had in criticism, so you too would also devalue criticism. Not to mention with a slew of bad takes, it made it harder to discern what good faith criticism was. One of the worst side effects of nerd culture going mainstream, in my opinion, was tying your morality to the media you consume, but thankfully, for the most part, that era of criticism has finally subsided. Now let's talk about the nerd to fascist pipeline, or how machine learning algorithms radicalized nerds to the alt-right in the 2010s. Basically, this system is the end result of everything we've been talking about. Firstly, you have some angry cis-het white nerds internalize the late 20th and early 21st century patriarchal male power fantasy of going from lowly nerd to tech millionaire. From there, they become even angrier when they become disillusioned with that dream, since only a small handful of geeks and nerds ever actually achieved capitalistic success. But rather than blame the capitalist patriarchy and toxic masculinity, they begin to believe that their oppression stems from the content they enjoy and identify with, and turn themselves into victims. But then this narrative too becomes disrupted when later the same material that they based their identity on became widely loved and accepted, thus making these men even more spiteful. This fire then continued to be stoked via the mass onslaught of criticism of said properties due to fourth-wave feminism and online activism. And thus, the alt-right, as opportunistic as ever, saw a new recruiting base primed to see their new wave fascist movement as a place of refuge, and both directly and indirectly brought angry white men over through creating content on platforms whose addicting algorithms work by suggesting the same content over and over, and by infiltrating online fandom spaces where these types of nerds typically hang out. The pipeline I'm going to describe is basically the pipeline that Ian Danskin from Innuendo Studios illustrated in their video entitled How to Radicalize a Normie, mixed with the pyramid of violence from the Pewdie pipeline by non-compete, but I've also added in some of my own details. So with all that said, let's take a stroll. Let's say you're just a regular cis-het white guy on the internet in the 2010s who describes themselves as a nerd. You have geeky interests, you go to conventions, you're a part of various fan forums, and have friends online who share your love of niche subcultures. But that's all that really binds you to these fan groups and friends, your shared love of X, Y, or Z. You don't really talk about your personal life or politics, even though you know a lot of the people in this space are politically left-leaning. Contrary to them, you think fandom isn't a place for politics, so it's just never come up. And when it has, you just kind of roll your eyes. But now a new movie from a franchise you like has been announced, and there's something different about the cast that makes you feel kind of uncomfortable, as if they're trying to right a past wrong the franchise has done, and therefore that you have done, as you tie so much of your own identity to said media. To cleanse your palate and assure yourself that you in no way could or would ever consume sexist or racist art, you start watching debunking videos on YouTube. These videos consist of atheists debunking creationists, because you see yourself as a rational centrist. But soon, those same people start to debunk feminism, and this content is the stuff that finally makes you feel seen. And your bias is continually confirmed, as a lot of the feminism you're seeing online is extremely cringe, mainly BuzzFeed talking about manspreading and how Disney princesses are problematic. Really? Disney princesses? Don't these people have lives, you'd think? This pop feminism only serves to push you further right, and again, confirm your bias that these angry women have nothing better to do. Instead of watching Anita Sarkeesian's videos, you watch people debunking them. And the gist you get is that she just wants to ruin things, when of course that wasn't the goal of her project, but that's what's being sold to you. And you choose not to listen to her actual thoughts because the algorithm and your human brain work together to keep you in your comfort zone, to keep you safe, to keep you from thinking too hard. And then, after watching some very angry videos about Sarkeesian, you start to get offered anti-Semitic videos, and then videos about natural selection. And the deeper you go, the more isolated you become from the media and the fellow fans that made you so angry in the first place. And the content gets more radical as well. But the key in keeping you inside is that you continue to think that you're at the periphery, at the tip of the iceberg, that all of this hateful rhetoric isn't hateful at all, that there's still more to discover, and that in the grand scheme of things, this is all a perfectly normal way of seeing the world. That's how the alt-right ensnares you, and how conspiracy theories work. They make you think that you're in on a secret, that you have the answers, when in fact you're someone else's puppet. And it's honestly really scary how just having open conversations about problems in works liked by nerdy white men radicalized so many of them. And they weren't just radicalized by machine learning algorithms, but also grifters and gurus who say that they have the answer as to why you're so unhappy as a dorky cishet white guy, and it's not toxic masculinity, it's immigrants, women, and Jewish people. Lastly, Ian Danskin's How to Radicalize a Normie video points out how members of hate groups infiltrate fandom spaces filled with nerds and geeks in order to sow discord. They do this by making an off-color joke and waiting to see who laughs, or by complaining about how bad the franchise they enjoy has become and how it was so much better back then, or say something to the effect of they should just hire the best people for the job, which ironically never happens to be people of color, LGBTQ+ people, or disabled people. And by manufacturing these rifts within fandom spaces, they can see who can be radicalized, and unfortunately it's usually cishet white men who have the most to gain from right-wing politics. So now I ask this question, were fandom spaces always filled with white men just waiting to be radicalized? Or did the mainstreaming of geek culture and the resulting critiques of said media make them this way? Honestly, speaking from experience, I think that there were always people who were more conservative in geeky or nerdy circles that were vulnerable to being radicalized, specifically of course white men. For example, I knew a lot of white male students back in my school days who hung out with the social outcasts. The social outcasts being kids of color, LGBTQ+ students, and people who were neurodivergent. These white boys were on the fringes because of their niche interests, and for not fitting in, and at times rejecting the hegemonic norm. Some were also neurodivergent themselves or identified as LGBTQ+. But a lot of them were just white boys who had nowhere else to go in the cafeteria. And they happened to like the same stuff we did, but were more likely to maybe push the boundaries with racist jokes, and we kind of just gave them passes for it because, hey, they like the same stuff we do, they can't be all bad. Also, as misfits and bully victims, we were empathetic to people who were also ostracized. But just because you like a certain thing doesn't mean you hold the same beliefs or even view or experience the property the same way and have the same takeaways. And though many of these white male peers were liberal in the beginning of the 2010s and liked Stephen Colbert and were pro-Obama, these same people ended up voting for Trump in 2016. Though of course this isn't true of all white cishet male fans, some are secure and self-aware enough to see through conservative dog whistles, don't take the bait, and don't feel threatened by more inclusivity and criticism of the things that they enjoy. But in all, a lot of these white male fanboys turn to the alt-right rather than learning and growing because it's just easier. It's the path of least resistance. The result of the mainstreaming of nerd culture and the subsequent exodus of a substantial amount of horrible people from various fandoms was unfortunately the alt-right gaining a lot of members. And thus they became a powerful force to be reckoned with, even getting their supreme leader elected, and Trump becoming president just let the worst people say the quiet part out loud. Former nerds and geeks also began to publicly hate the media that they once loved and called theirs for so long for being too woke. Because once that was gone from their identity, once everyone was a nerd, no one was, and all that was left was white rage. The rise of the alt-right online has of course also led to grifters who don't actually believe in what they're saying, they're just doing it for money and don't care about the actual real harm they're doing to their audience, but also to the marginalized people they condemn, specifically trans people. Algorithms also still pull people towards the worst content imaginable, especially if you're a man online. Even if you are in real life pretty liberal or even center, you will still be shown anti-democrat posts that start out with just making fun of how old Biden is, but that ends with men talking about traditional values and that women are whores. If you have a man or boy in your life, see the content that they're being shown and tell them to be aware of it, because if you go down that rabbit hole, you might never come back. In conclusion, fandom spaces always were a bit toxic and still are, even though on paper they seem like a utopic place where people of all backgrounds can come together in peace and love. And though fandom can be fun and a great place a lot of the time, there's always going to be gatekeepers and just god-awful people waiting for an excuse to be, well, god-awful. And now we have to be extra vigilant for people actively trying to radicalize us within fandom. I'm trying to find a silver lining here where I can say things will be better in the future, but I can't really say that yet. Only time will tell. In all, I do think it's good that Disney, for example, is standing by their actors of color, but it took so goddamn long that it's not even that commendable at this point. In the end, the only thing these studios, who are run by majority white people, specifically white men, care about is money. They don't care if a creator is transphobic and a fascist, they don't care about the fans on the margins who propped up this property to begin with, they only care about the bottom line and who holds the most disposable income, which are people who look like them. I think the best way individuals like us can make a change is not taking the bait when people want to start an off-the-cuff conservative debate about how the media today is being ruined by the liberal agenda. The best thing to do is block, ignore, and shut it down before it starts, because one of the debate tactics of the right is that everything is up for debate, and they make sure the debate is never over, so it always seems as though they're winning. Watch the alt-right Playbook for more info. You can also make it known to those around you that you don't tolerate bigoted shit, even if it costs you relationships, because the worst people are those who do and say nothing at the time of injustice. Not to end this video on an incredibly corny note, but as Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, the ultimate tragedy is not the oppression and cruelty by the bad people, but the silence over that by the good people. So that's it for this one. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.